Hello, and welcome to another episode of Restoring the Right Hand videocast. Today, we're going to be talking about an article that was published in February 16th, 2022 by Professor Miller. But before we get into that, I just want to remind you of a couple things, and we'll look at it right here. Just want to remind you that we will be posting videos on YouTube. And of course, this one may not make the cut, but we do have a YouTube channel. The majority of our videos and will be published on Rumble. So if you can, please subscribe there. That'll be a great way. And of course, you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter, and that's a great way to keep up with us. So here's the article. The article was actually, I guess, from a sermon or speech that Professor Nick Miller gave, The Pandemic Vaccination, the Crisis of Adventist Identity. And we're going to go over this. I just want to also point out that my co-author and friend, Michael Ferris, did a whole series dealing with some of the assumptions that Professor Miller actually makes. And he actually goes through and details these things and provides a different point of view, backing it up with scripture and church history. So if you, after this video, you're interested, please go check out this series. You will enjoy it. All right. So before we get going, I just want you to know this, that everyone has a bias. I have a bias. My co-author has a bias. You can clearly see it in our videos and our understanding of church history, our understanding of scripture. We have a bias. We try to step away from that. We try to stick to the facts, but it is something we all have. And so it's important to note these things before you looking at the arguments. Again, we all have them and we should acknowledge them. But I just want to point out that Professor Miller, who comes off as an expert in church history, theology, and apparently mandates and vaccination history within the church, he also has a bias. And this is a video that he did talking about critical race theory, where he finds that critical race theory is a valid form of understanding history, politics, and law. And he says so, and he's very open about it. And indeed, this is the same professor who also marched during the BLM protest, the Black Lives Matter protest at Andrews University. So he has a bias and background. He was also co-author of a religious liberty publication called Waymarks, and it was right after the Biden election. And he talks about the dangers of those who question the election. He talks about the rise of Christian nationalism, and he felt, maybe he and the other co-authors, I'm not exactly sure, but I have a feeling they all agreed upon it, but he felt that the Biden election was actually a reprieve from this terrible right-wing overthrow of our constitutional rights, and that it was going to be better for the people of the United States to give us a reprieve to do God's work, and that the agenda that they would bring in would not necessarily be good, but it would be manageable. So this gives you an idea of what his background is. This gives you an idea of the place that he's coming from. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, this is just where he's coming from, and I think that's important to acknowledge. I don't come from that background. I disagree with critical race theory. I have serious problems about an organization like Black Lives Matter who says that the nuclear family should be done away with and consider themselves trained Marxists. I also am pretty bothered by the fact that the leaders of that movement took money and made millions of dollars while not giving the family members of the people who they supposedly were supporting, not giving them a dime. So I think there's a lot to be said about that, but that's not why we're here. We're here to look at his article. So here's his article. And in the beginning, you can see this. And I highlighted this, and we're just going to start right here. He says that certain elements of right-wing Adventism in the larger evangelical Christian world have reacted urgently and even defiantly to a relatively benign federal government COVID rule that encouraged vaccination but allowed for masking and testing for those that object. Now, I love this right here because he's taking this idea that he's saying right-wing Advent. Right away, he's trying to condemn a part of the church, saying they're right-wing and they're aligning themselves with evangelicals, and they're upset about benign requirements. Like, it's no big deal to take a shot in the arm. It's no big deal to have your job threatened. It's no big deal to be tested every week. It's no big deal to wear a mask. It's no big deal to be extricated from society. That's how he sees it. And I want to point out that he's trying to align those in the church who may not even be right-wing. There may be people who are liberal as the day is long, but they object to mandates. They have a real problem with it. And so to lump everyone in is to try to create a situation of guilt by association, saying that these Adventists are acting like evangelicals. Indeed, other ministers have tried to do the same, such as Pastor Ivor Myers, as you might have seen in some of his videos, where he tries to lump in Adventists who disagree with mandates to espousing evangelical theology. Well, two can play at that game. And I don't think it's a fair game, but I just want you to see this. Well, this guy, who happens to be the leader of the Catholic Church, the CEO of Vatican City, if you will, which is of a sovereign nation, and he believes that vaccination is an act of love. He believes that people should do this. Indeed, WebMD actually reported on Pope Francis's views and actually pointed out how he feels that getting the shot is a moral obligation. The Catholic Church has a history of supporting mandates, a history of supporting laws and rules that crack down on people's ability to say no to a shot in the arm, and had no problem suspending people actually meting out its own punishments and giving people who went along with these things rewards, supports vaccination. And a large chunk of the evangelicals support vaccination with this vaccine. So is Professor Miller and all those who support them, are they espousing a Catholic view? Are they in league with Pope Francis and the World Council of Churches? Is that who they are? You see, we can play this game of association, but it's not fair to them. And it's not fair to those who stand in my corner, who question the mandates, have serious questions regarding the vaccine, and wonder if we can ever get to the point where we understand religious liberty in its broadest sense. But nonetheless, I just want to show you the technique that they were using. I am not going to say that Professor Miller and those who agree with him are in league with the Vatican. That I have no evidence of that. They may agree on this issue, but that doesn't make them in league. And nor would I say they're espousing Catholic or World Council of Church theology. But see, they have no problem doing that to those whom they disagree with. The very thing that they accuse us of doing, they themselves are doing, attacking their fellow brethren who have not attacked them in this way. Here's the second part that I want to highlight, and this is only the first paragraph. He says this, but the same group, those who oppose mandates, who oppose COVID-19 vaccination, he says this, but this same group has had very little to say about the deaths of about 850,000 of our fellow citizens in the United States and many more millions around the world. Now, this is troubling because he acts like those who don't want the vaccine could care less about those who died. They could care less about those who died. So right now, he is already within a few sentences has accused his fellow brethren of being but right-winged and aligned with a larger evangelical Christian world, which isn't entirely true because many evangelicals support the mandates and support the vaccine. But nonetheless, he tries to do guilt by association. And in the second sentence, he likes to say that his fellow brethren who pray in the name of Jesus are unconcerned about the many deaths around the world. So again, let's just look at some facts here and some things, because what I would say is that those on his side have indeed adopted hyperbole and fear-mongering in addition to being unconcerned about other types of people dying from other things, as we will look. This is an article from the World Health Organization that was published in the World Health Bulletin by Professor John P. Ioannidis. And what's fascinating about this is he talks about the infection fatality rate. And what they did is they looked at blood bank data where they were able to analyze people who said, I have not had COVID, but indeed have antibodies to COVID. So these were people who were asymptomatic carriers whose bodies fought it off. And this then lowered the idea. This then gave us an idea of how much of the population actually had COVID, but had no ill effects of it, while we have an idea of how many people died from it. So he examined all the different infection fatality rates from different locations around the world. In this, listen to what he says. For people younger than 70 years old, the infection fatality rate of COVID-19 across 40 locations with the available data ranged from 0.00% to 0.31%, the median 0.05%. He actually ends up going on saying that looking at all of it, he estimates a 0.23% for infection fatality. That's what he ends up saying. Now, what's fascinating about this, and this is one of the things I want to point out, is I circled one of the dots here. I circled it and you can see the red circle around it. And on that red dot, it's fascinating because that location is New York. That location was New York, where they had a policy of taking people who tested COVID positive and putting them in nursing homes where a lot of people died. Now, one of the things I never noticed with Nick Miller and those who agree with him and those who've been supporting vaccines is they didn't seem to care that the calloused policy of the governor of New York actually increased deaths from COVID. They didn't care about that. I will stand corrected if you will find me a video or something that they wrote where they were concerned about that. Because as far as I know, in the research I've done, they are not concerned about it. In addition to the 850,000 people who have died from COVID in the United States, it is interesting to note that many people believe that this number was inflated. And in fact, they found the CDC, which is obviously pro-vaccine, they actually found that most people, over 94% of those who died, had at least 3 comorbidities. They died with other things. And these were other things that were attributed to their deaths, which means that there were many people who died with COVID, not from COVID, which is a distinction that the CDC is trying to make now. They didn't make this distinction in the beginning, but now that a large segment of the population has been vaccinated, they are trying to be more careful about who's actually dying from COVID than actually who is dying with COVID. And there was a famous case in Florida of a gentleman who got hit by a truck on a motorcycle, went to the hospital, they tested him for COVID, and he ended up dying from his injuries from being hit on a motorcycle. He didn't die from COVID, but he was reported as a COVID death. And this happened across the board. And this is why these numbers, while they are terrible, need to be taken with a grain of salt. But no one on that side of the aisle is concerned about that. Instead, we have to believe in the narrative. But here's something that I think is more troubling to me. This article was written by Joel Zinberg, who is a medical doctor and lawyer. And listen to what he says about the policy of lockdowns. He says, as we consider how to deal with the resurgent numbers of COVID cases, we must acknowledge that mitigation measures like shelter in place and lockdowns appear to have contributed to the death toll. The orders were issued by states and localities in late March. Excess deaths peaked in the week ending April 11th. Reopening began in mid-April, and by May, all states that imposed orders started to lift restrictions. In June, as the economy continued to reopen, excess deaths waned. Our focus must be on ensuring that the healthcare system can simultaneously treat COVID and other maladies and reassuring patients that it's safe to seek care. Otherwise, today's young physicians will have to start entering a new cause of death on the death certificates, public policy. Now, sometimes I know this would be considered conspiracy theory, but it seems pretty credible to me. He is a clinical professor of surgery at Mount Sinai Aiken School of Medicine in New York. He has also served as counsel and senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors from 2017 to 2019, where he specializes in health policy. So he believes that many of the excess deaths that we have are not people who died from COVID, but actually died because of the lockdowns. And guess what? He's not alone. The National Bureau of Economic Research published an article written by KCB Mulligan. And what they found is, and I'll just read it to you, weekly mortality through October 3rd is partitioned into normal deaths, COVID and non-COVID excess deaths. Before March, the excess is a negative for the elderly, likely due to mild flu season. From March onward, excess deaths were approximately 250,000, of which about 17,000 to be a COVID undercount. So they believe that there was an undercount of COVID deaths. And 30,000 non-COVID deaths. So wait, just look at what he just said there. He just said that there were more excess deaths from non-COVID causes than actual COVID during this excess death that they reported during the lockdown time. And notice what he says: deaths of despair, drug overdose, suicide, alcohol in 2017 and 2018 are good predictors of the demographic groups with non-COVID excess deaths in 2020. The non-COVID excess deaths are disproportionately experienced by men aged 15 to 55, including men aged 15 to 25. Local data on opioid overdoses further support the hypothesis that the pandemic and recession were associated with a 10 to 60% increase in deaths of despair above already high pre-pandemic levels. In other words, the lockdowns causing despair, drug use, alcohol abuse, suicides, all these things were dramatically increased during lockdowns. Now, again, I would love to see that my fellow brethren who are in the church actually care about these people. I know that it's the cause du jour to care about the people who died from COVID in a number that has been overestimated, but why not care about the people who lost everything in 1 year? Everything. Indeed, data shows that drug overdose surged 30%. 30%. We had 30% increase in drug overdose deaths, not to mention how many people started taking drugs during this. This is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, PhD, MD, and he pointed out that during the lockdown, that they found that 1 in 4 young adults reported serious thoughts of suicide. In other words, even young people after being locked down, after being made afraid, became so distraught that more of them, 1 in 4, considered committing suicide. In other countries that are poor, almost 250,000 children died because of the lockdown because they didn't have access to normal social services. Again, I'm wondering, when are we going to get a video, an article saying we care about those people who died? When are we going to get an article where they say, the lockdown really was harmful to the poor and vulnerable of society, which every economist knows, every serious epidemiologist knows. They know that these lockdowns, which, according to Professor Miller, are biblical, but the interesting thing is that where did you ever read in the Old Testament that when a case of leprosy is found or suspected, that you lock down the village? If that were the case, the nation of Israel would have been locked down until Jesus showed up. But that was not the case. They understood quarantine, that the person who was sick had to be put outside the camp or be among the leper colony, and that's what they did. That's how they did it, so society could go on. That's what the Bible says. It doesn't say shut down society so people can't do anything. That's not what it said. Here's another article. This article is from the Journal of Preventative Medicine. And in this article, they examine the causes of death in Peru. And what they noticed is that there was an increase in homicide, suicide, and car accidents, in particularly in young men during the lockdown. And as soon as the lockdowns ended, all these deaths precipitously diminished. So think about it. Many people died from murder, suicide, from accidents, and who knows, maybe the accidents because the people were increased drinking or using drugs. I mean, this is impressive. I'm going to read the second paragraph at the bottom. External deaths presented a sudden drop after the lockdown was implemented, and an increase in homicide in men was observed. So during the lockdown, more people were killing each other. Falls and mobility have a natural impact on traffic accidents. However, the pattern for suicide and homicide are less intuitive and reveal important characteristics of these events, although we expect all of these changes to be transient. They even noticed how many people committed suicide. Again, I'm waiting for those who support the lockdown, support the heavy-handed tactics of the government. And I know they say they don't support the mandates, but that is a crocodile tear if I've ever seen one. Anyways, we look at this article here. Insurance companies note a 40% rise in deaths. And these deaths were actually in working age people between 18 and 65. In other words, the insurance companies who are looking at the deaths noticed that these non-COVID deaths spiked in their system, which again points to the idea that these lockdowns, these policies were very harmful on people's mental health and their form of living, especially when you bankrupt people and they lose everything. Again, no concern about this, nothing to say about this. Instead, it's all about pointing out how the other side is essentially evil. Now, I want to point this out because I said that they support mandates. Professor Miller says he doesn't support mandates, and this is his own words. All right, so I want you to see this. This is what he says. At the outset, I want to be clear. I do not support general vaccine mandates. This is not because I do not believe that vaccines are safe and useful. I do believe, based on the studies I have reviewed, as well as the opinions of health experts in position of trust in the church and government, that COVID vaccines are both safe and effective. But I also believe that mandating upon all workers is counterproductive because of the resistance it provokes. So it's not that it's bad per se. It's bad because people don't want it. And so he thinks that that's, not really good. And this is the same position that Dr. Roger Schwelt, Dr. Sean Pittman both take. They say, hey, we don't really believe in the mandates, but only because people begin to resist the vaccine because there's a mandate, and that's not good. We want people to take the shot. So he says for this and for other reasons, I think general mandates are unwise and unconstitutional. Though I agree with the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling that vaccine requirements in healthcare industry are justified protection of vulnerable and at-risk patients. Yeah, well, this is important because the U.S. Supreme Court based their decision on actually misinformation. It had someone actually explain to them, which I don't think they were willing to hear, that the vaccine does not prevent the transmission of the virus. Doesn't do it. Their whole decision was based on the fact that if they were vaccinated, the healthcare workers were vaccinated, that the virus wouldn't spread. But data shows now that it doesn't. And as a matter of fact, they never tested it. Now, of course, Professor Miller would think that's a conspiracy theory, but we will look at that later on. I also want to point out this. I'll try to put a link to his article in the comment section so everyone can read it for themselves. I am not going to go through the entire article point by point. I'm just going to highlight some of the things that I think need to be addressed. Anyways, this is actually what he believes. So when he says he doesn't believe in mandates, this is an article that was published, I believe, in 2020. It was, or 2021. It was in the Lake Union Herald. And in this article, Professor Miller tells you exactly what he believes about the mandate. So listen to this. And this to me seems a bit like doublespeak, all right? He says, let us not add more to the number by making claims of freedom. He's talking about the deaths. He's always very concerned about the deaths. He's not the deaths of despair, not the deaths of suicide, not the deaths of alcohol abuse, drug abuse, not the deaths associated with accidents and all these other things. None of those. Not concerned with that, but with only COVID-19 deaths. Anyways, he says, let us not add more to that number by making claims of freedom of conscience that neither Luther nor any of the Adventist pioneers would recognize or accept. Now, that last part about the Adventist pioneers is completely inaccurate. And I'm not sure how you can be a professor in the church history department and make that statement in good conscience unless you're either ignoring information or refuse to even look at information that would contradict your view. I don't know which one it is. I can't read the heart. He says, I'm not arguing for mandatory vaccination. So look, listen to his argument. I'm not arguing for mandatory vaccination, but listen to what he says. But I am saying that your choice not to be vaccinated will appropriately come with limitations on community participation, work, and travel. You cannot fairly decry these limitations as violations of your fundamental Protestant principles of freedom once you understand their true history and nature, and even the more fundamental right your neighbors and friends to stay alive. Now listen to that. So in other words, he says, yeah, I'm not for the mandates, but if you lose your job, if you can't travel, if you can't participate meaningfully in society, going to a restaurant, or your kid's not wearing masks at school, if you don't go along, that's what you deserve. That doesn't sound to me like you're against the mandates. Now, maybe he changed his mind. This article was published before the last article, but I don't think so. I don't think he's changed his mind one iota. And as a matter of fact, the whole argument, I'm not arguing for mandatory vaccination, I think is just merely a way to try to disarm those who would disagree with him. And in fact, he has no problems with the mandate that the Supreme Court said and left in place by by overruling the stay against the CMS, the Center of Medicare Services, CMS mandate. I mean, he actually supports that. He says, yes, nurses should lose their jobs. People who are front desk people should lose their jobs if they refuse to get the vaccine, even though that's not even based on solid scientific evidence. And then he goes on here, he says, the vast majority of health experts in the state and church agree that opposition to COVID vaccines is not based on good scientific evidence, but on misinformation mixed with various unreliable conspiracy theories, at times framed in an Adventist prophetic outlook. These often involve suspicion of government and health leaders and the belief that they are actively ignoring the deaths of citizens and perhaps even acting to bring such deaths about. From firsthand experiencing, I know that mixing anti-government conspiracies with Adventist prophecies can be a dangerous and even lethal combination. Now, I just want to point out here, we're not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to point out here that there's a lot that Professor Miller would consider conspiracy theory that actually isn't conspiracy theory. And I'm not sure that he has actually taken the time to analyze all the scientific evidence. Neither am I sure that he's actually taken the time to analyze all the evidence from our own history. As a matter of fact, he goes on and he talks about how he and his religious liberty colleagues don't like the idea of using religious liberty to fight against the vaccine. He doesn't like that even though that they will draft your own personal exemption for whatever conscientious reasons you have, but don't align yourself with the church. This is the same thing. You guys get to take a bath and I get to sit in my place where I never have to worry about losing my job because I'm on the winning team. Now, what's funny is that I listened to this discussion that he had in several other videos that he was a part of. I think the other one that I'm going to cite, as well as this one, is the one where he is speaking with Ivor Myers and other physicians. And one of the things that he mentioned there is that he had looked through 100 years of Adventist history and couldn't find really anything of an anti-vaccination movement. And in fact, he believes that the anti-vaccination movement, which is really a movement against mandates, is anti-intellectual, and it was mostly limited to E.J. Wagner. This is not even true. This is actually lazy research. And I believe that Professor Miller, as a matter of fact, I have personal knowledge of it, is actually a very smart man. And I know that he gets paid to sit around and he had access to archives, to write articles, to publish books and teach church history. That's what he gets paid to do. So he has every advantage to avail himself of the information that is out there. And it seems like he's unwilling to do it because this narrative, this agenda, towing the line is more important. Anyways, so he is very clear that he doesn't believe that the anti-vaccinationist movement in our church was ever serious or anything like that. Now, he says that he looked at 100 years of Adventist history. So I'm wondering if he started in 1920 and ended in 2020, or if he started in 1918 and ended in 2018. I don't know what 100 years he was looking at, but he wasn't looking at the very beginning. As early as 1869, there were articles published in the Health Reformer, and I don't know who the editors of this were, which talked about clearly that they were against vaccination. They felt that it was against the health message. Again, we have one of our earliest evangelists, J.N. Loughborough. J.N. Loughborough was one of our earliest evangelists, joined the anti-vaccinationist league in Great Britain. And well, the best part about that is he was never censured by Ellen White for doing that. He was never censured, and he was bothered by the way that the strong arm tactics of the state to forcibly plunge unhealthy vaccine matter into the arms of people. And he recounts it here. This was actually published in an anti-vaccinationist journal. So this was part of our history. In addition to this, we have John Harvey Kellogg, who before the General Conference in 1899 comes out and says that vaccination is the human way of fighting disease, but our health message is greater, and that if we stick to it, we would not need to be vaccinated. That's what he said before the General Conference. And while we know he left the church, he wasn't kicked out of the church over this issue. This was not something that everyone got angry and said, how dare you say that? You're causing deaths. And this is a guy who got to see smallpox, for which the vaccine that he's discussing, he got to see it up close and personal. It wasn't like it didn't exist and it wasn't killing people. This is a close friend and associate of Ellen G. White, Daniel H. Kress, who was also a physician trained from the University of Michigan. And he even points out that compulsory vaccination didn't really help Prussia. It wasn't until Prussia began to use hygiene and clean things up and improve nutrition of society that actually smallpox went down. Later on, he was asked directly about his opinion while he's the editor of the Australasian Good Health. In 1904, he was asked his opinion about vaccines, and he goes on to say that he doesn't think that they were necessary, that to poison one wasn't the way to treat the virus, that he believed that the health message could lift people above it. Now, this isn't to say that everyone agreed with Daniel Kress in 1904 or that everyone agreed with Kellogg in 1899, but what it does tell you is that the church's position then, while Ellen White was alive and writing and very much involved in our publications and the publishing process, and her husband was alive at those times early on, what it does tell you is that they didn't think that these opinions were extreme or needed to be censored or were part of some right-wing conspiracy theory. They didn't think that. They didn't stop it. And again, there's another anonymous letter that was actually published in the Ellen White estate, which I did a whole video on, which you can find on Rumble and on YouTube. I did a whole video on, and the document is Q34E2. And this was published around, we don't know, in 1962. And this person who published it in the Ellen White estate, we don't know who it is, it's completely anonymous, has a axe to grind with vaccination. And he actually points to the health message being greater. So this anti-vaccination sentiment that he just dismissively throws away is completely ignorant of this history here. On top of that, what he also discounts was the change in the way that we did medicine. A number of other factors came along that are so important to understanding the historical context of why the position was changed from vaccine skepticism or the idea that the health message was greater, or even people who believed in vaccines but were against the mandates, why that suddenly changed after 1915. And this is documented in the book that my co-author and I wrote. We actually go through more history here, and we even look at all the statements of those who made statements about Ellen White's opinion on vaccines, and we analyze it all, put it all together, and try to put these things in context as well. So we do all of that, and I think it would be, if you are interested in that, you will enjoy reading it. So this is probably the most egregious thing that Professor Miller does. He comes out and he talks about the Branch Davidians, and he talks about this because they had their own anti-government conspiracy. They thought that they were real problems, and he talks about how David Koresh was a charismatic guy who talked about Adventist theology. Well, there's a real problem with that, because if you looked at anything that David Koresh taught or the Branch Davidians taught about Adventist prophecy, it's completely out of left field. If you studied Adventist prophecy and you read some of our great historical works on it, and you've actually spent time with Revelation, you don't come to that conclusion. But one of the reasons why many people, like friends of Professor Miller who left Newbold and went to Waco, Texas, joined David Koresh, is because they weren't hearing about the teaching of prophecy very often in their own churches. And indeed, what was sad about this whole thing is that the poor people who were in the compound, and I don't agree with them at all theologically. There was a lot that was out to lunch. I don't believe that David Koresh was a good man, but I do believe that the government's response was definitely heavy-handed. It's also important to point out that a number of the people who were arrested as being part of the Branch Davidians, a number of them who were arrested were actually, when they went to try them for the murder of the 4 ATF agents who died there, they actually were acquitted. And they were acquitted because there was evidence that the government struck first and was very heavy-handed in its response. You never hear that. But again, I'm not here to defend them, but what I am here to say is that it's completely egregious to take those who disagree with you on the mandates and try to associate them with the Branch Davidians. If there's anyone causing division in the church, it's you when you do that. This is how you malign at least 25% of the church who don't like these mandates, who don't want this vaccine. Many of the people in this movement who are against the vaccine mandates have taken every other vaccine and had no problem with vaccines, but they felt this heavy-handed government approach was a bridge too far for them, particularly with this vaccine, considering its history with being studied, its history, what we know about the deaths and injuries, all of it was too much. And so they stood up and said, hey, we got to do something about this. To associate that with the Branch Davidians living in a compound, taking guns and spoiling for a fight with the government is not only irresponsible, but I would say almost not anti-Christian. This is not a Christian response that you make to people that you allegedly care about, love, and pray for. This is a way of maligning 25% of the church and discrediting them by guilt by association. That's wrong. Listen to what he says here, and this is completely egregious. And most important and most tragic comparison is undeniable. Notice, he doesn't back down. He says it's undeniable. The comparison between the Branch Davidians and those who resist mandates. That is completely censurable that he would even write that. He should apologize to all those in the church who actually believe that mandates are wrong. He should apologize to those who lost their jobs, those who've had to hit hard economic times because of this. And he should also apologize to those who have been injured and family members who have lost people who actually took the shot. He should apologize to all of them because this is entirely irresponsible. And this, and I know him personally, this I would say is beneath the man. Shouldn't have done that. We all do things that we shouldn't have done, but he shouldn't have done that, not in his position of responsibility. And he says this, the anti-COVID vaccine movement has contributed to the needless deaths of more Adventists than David Koresh ever did. Where in the world do you get that? How in the world do you make that statement with a straight face? This is maligning 25% of the church. This is just simply associating them and saying that they're responsible for more deaths. You're out of your mind. You have gone too far, and you should apologize and repent for even making the statement. If you ever want to see how things will shake out at the end of time, you see instances, or this is an example of how it will happen where church members will turn upon each other. Those who sit in the ivory towers, those who are part of the Adventist elite, will attack those who they think are beneath them and malign them with the most terrible epithets that you could ever imagine. This is more in line with harmony of the medieval popes who maligned and attacked the Waldenses than a Seventh-day Adventist who believes in the Bible. This is Unconscionable. And notice this. Does Professor Miller care about Jeannie Norris, who was a 48-year-old woman who died after taking the shot? This is actually published in the Adventist Record in Australia. And they actually mentioned that their version of the FDA, the Therapeutic Goods Association, admits that she died from the vaccine. Any thoughts and prayers for her family? Any caring about them? What about all those people in the US military who started to contract myocarditis after the mandatory vaccine rollout? This is the Non-Conspiracy Journal of American Medical Association 2021 article talking about how they need to look more into this because they're getting a signal that these young, healthy men, particularly men, are coming down with myocarditis. Does Professor Miller care about any of them? Is he concerned with that? What about this study here where they found, this was a preprint, this is August 2021 study, and what they found is, and you can see it here, they found that in 16 to 17-year-old boys without comorbidities, the risk of post-dose 2 vaccination cardiac adverse events exceeds their current 120-day hospital risk by 2.1 times. Now, I just want you to understand this. What they were looking at is that what's your likelihood of being hospitalized by a cardiac adverse event versus being hospitalized from COVID? And what they found in young boys from 16 to 17, that you were 2.1 times more likely to be hospitalized from the vaccine, having a cardiac adverse event, than you were from COVID-19. That's what they estimate. It says our estimated risk of post-second vaccination dose of cardiac adverse events hospitalization for boys 12 to 15 without medical comorbidities also exceeds that of their 120-day COVID-19 hospitalization risk, even at high hospitalization rates. For 12 to 17-year-old boys with at least one medical comorbidity, their post-vaccination cardio adverse event only exceeds their 120-day COVID-19 hospitalization risk at low times of hospitalization rates. So even young men with actual comorbidities at high hospitalization rates for COVID-19, it does not exceed that. But at low hospitalization rates, the risks of being vaccinated and having a cardiac adverse event, according to this study, demonstrates that the vaccine for this group of children is more dangerous and leads to more likely to being hospitalized than actually being hospitalized from getting COVID-19. And this is well known. Many people have pointed out over and over again how children are not at risk of hospitalization and death from COVID-19. The data is shown over and over again. Here's another study. This was also published in the Non-Conspiracy Theory journal, JAMA, in 2021. And this was about stroke, or as they say, cerebral sinus venous thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. And this was looking at I believe the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And what's interesting is in this first sentence here where it says limitations, because they were looking at all these people who had these events, and they were trying to analyze them and see what the risks were. It says this case series has several limitations. First, theirs is a passive surveillance system. So even with public notification of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis and thrombocytopenia following the Johnson & Johnson vaccination, cases of CVST and with thrombocytopenia may be underreported. So they know right away, looking at VAERS, because it is a passive system. In other words, people are, while they are supposed to report all vaccine adverse events, because it's passive and people seldom do, they said, hey, we're dealing with something that is greatly underreported. And now notice they're only looking at one batch of vaccines. They're only looking at one, which is kind of interesting. I just want to point this out. This is case number 5. And this is a woman between the ages of 18 and 39. I'm just going to read what happened, all right? Shortly after vaccination, the patient developed a single self-limited febrile episode. Approximately 6 days after the vaccination, she developed a fever, rigors, shortness of breath, jaw pain, and headache. Testing at an emergency department did not identify specific etiology. She was prescribed azithromycin. Fevers, rigors, and shortness of breath resolved, but headaches associated with visual changes continued. Approximately 16 days after vaccination, she developed ecchymoses, periorbital and lower extremity petechia, bilateral, this is like bruising, bilateral lower extremity pain, right lower extremity swelling, and intermittent shortness of breath. She presented to an outpatient facility for care. An ultrasound revealed a right lower extremity deep vein thrombosis, and she was prescribed dabigatran, which is a thrombin inhibitor to break up the clotting. No platelet count was recorded. 17 days after vaccination, she lost consciousness and was transported to the emergency department. She had a platelet count. I'm not even going to deal with that. Magnetic resonance imaging, which would be low. Magnetic resonance imaging of the brain revealed right transverse sinus venous thrombosis and right internal jugular vein thrombosis. Now, what the interesting thing is, we don't know if she died. We don't know if she died, but the question is this: her risk of dying from COVID, especially if she had no comorbidities between the ages of 18 and 39, are exceptionally low. Exceptionally low. How many people like this woman, how many people who were not at risk for stroke, not at risk for myocarditis, pericarditis, not at risk for transverse myelitis, got these things because they took the shot, because heavy-handed actions of government made them do it, and because people were unwilling to think critically about this medical procedure. How many people? But it goes on. This was a report that was that Dr. Stephen Gundry shared with the American Heart Association. And what's interesting is that he looked at his large group of patients, and he looked at all these patients, and he looked at their risk of heart attack before the vaccine rollout. And then he looked at the same patients who had taken the shot, which was in their medical record, and he found that their score, which determines their risk of having a heart attack, had greatly increased. In other words, that they, before the vaccine, were at a lower risk of heart attack, and after the vaccine, all the different metrics which tell you that you're going to have a heart attack in the future, making it more of a certainty, increased. So we may be experiencing an epidemic of heart attacks in the future, greater than, and it's already the #1 killer in the United States, so you can only imagine that things will get worse. Again, how many people have been put at risk because of this? Because we did the heavy hand arm of government on top of people's decisions and said, it's not really your body, and it's certainly not your choice. You're going to have to take the shot. Again, I just wonder, when Professor Miller talks about how many people who have died, who have listened to those who are against the mandates, who have died, is he even concerned about any of these people whose lives have been upended and harmed by the vaccine? I don't think so. Instead, he wants to compare his own church members to the Branch Davidians. Then he has this statement here. It became apparent that the religious liberty theme is a fig leaf to cover the hardcore anti-COVID vax and government conspiracy message that lies at the heart of the movement. Wow. Completely discrediting his own brethren. Well, what's interesting about this is that had he paid attention, and he is a professor in the Department of Church History, so I would expect him to be able to find some of the very things that I and my co-author found. And here's something that's very interesting. This is not an anti-government conspiracy theory. In 1910, M.C. Wilcox, who was the editor of Signs of the Times, published an article talking about the arrest of a man who was a part of an anti-vaccinationist group. This man was arrested because the local doctor, who didn't like this, said that they had no right to meet. And M.C. Wilcox, who believes in vaccines, he actually says so. But what he is concerned about is the idea that government would force vaccines in the arms of people, silence people from meeting and having free association. He feels that all of that is going to be in harmony of religious paternalistic legislation in the future. That's what he believed. Is he a conspiracy theorist? He saw this with his own eyes. He saw how the controlling mechanism of organized medicine to silence and use the government to squelch any dissident. He saw that as being in harmony with paternalistic religious legislation that will take away the rights of people. He saw that in there. This is no conspiracy. This is what he said. I'm surprised that Professor Miller hasn't looked into it. The other thing that bothers me, calling everyone anti-government conspiracy theorists, is this. Is it a conspiracy theory that Australia built COVID-19 concentration camps where people had to be isolated in these camps, couldn't leave? Once they tested positive for COVID, they had to stay there. Is that a conspiracy theory? Well, here's tweets from the Australian government, how they're celebrating a regional quarantine facility. I mean, look, even the picture, they have to wear masks while they're outside. No scientific evidence of that. But is it a conspiracy theory? Should not Adventists be concerned who value liberty about their own fellow brethren being locked down in a quarantine camp? Could not these quarantine camps also be used for other things in the future? Shouldn't you be concerned? Shouldn't that be a problem? Here's again more evidence talking about the Australian COVID camps. And listen, this is a publication I think Professor Miller enjoys, The Atlantic. And what's fascinating about this is Connor Freisdorf actually believes that there should be a trade between public health and liberty. He actually believes that. He says this in this article. But then he goes on and says, hey, this is a little Orwellian when the Australian government says that when you've tested positive for COVID, you have to download an app on your phone. And when you download this app on the phone, that if they detect that you're outside of the safe zone, that means your house and maybe around it, they will send you a message. And within 15 minutes, you have to take a picture of yourself, your surroundings, and send that back to them. Otherwise, you'll be fined. And even he, who sides on the sides of vaccine, even he who believes you need to trade some liberty for safety, he felt that this was a bridge too far. He said they didn't even do that during the Spanish flu. They didn't even do these type of things. He's concerned about your rights being taken away. But somehow this is conspiracy theory when Seventh-day Adventists voice these same concerns, say, hey, this is going a little too far here. Professor Miller goes on. He goes, the main speakers at the meetings promoted these anti-vaccine groups repeatedly warned that the vaccine is not only not effective, but is downright harmful, causing tens of thousands of deaths. The claim is made that the government and media cover up these deaths and also suppress the effectiveness of alternative and natural forms of prevention and treatment. In making these claims, they often rely on VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System data in a way that is demonstrably misguided and highly misleading, resulting in the false conclusions about the impact of vaccines. In short, what they cite as causation is merely correlation. Now, this is pretty bold. The interesting thing about this is that I know that Professor Miller's wife is a medical doctor, but I also know that he's intelligent enough to know that you don't get medical knowledge by osmosis. And I know that he knows that. I also know that he hasn't looked at the VAERS data. I also know that he doesn't understand the VAERS data. I also know that he has probably no idea how the VAERS system even came about. Now, if he does, I will stand corrected. But I'm pretty sure he doesn't, because he wouldn't have written this in this way. I don't think he's trying to be misleading. I just think that these statements here are made out of ignorance. Because what you have to understand about VAERS is that it only exists because after 1986, there were so many deaths and injuries from the diphtheria tetanus pertussis vaccine, and particularly the pertussis part, that they had to create the National Vaccination Compensation Injury Program. This program shielded drug companies from liability and also allowed parents of injured children to get some sort of compensation for the injury or death of their child. They thought this was a win-win. And one of the stipulations that was in the legislation is they had to create a reporting system so that they could get signals from vaccines when they put them on the market to see if they were indeed harming people. That's what they did. And what's fascinating about this is that it doesn't even detect all of them. Here's one of the problems that I have, is that I don't think that we've actually taken the amount of people who've been injured by this seriously enough. Here's the Senate testimony of Stephanie and Maddie DeGarry testifying about her injuries. Maddie is the young girl. She actually has a nasal gastric tube. That's how she feeds. She actually enrolled in the Pfizer BioNTech trials for children. Her mom enrolled her in there because they thought they were doing their part. They thought that they were going to further scientific knowledge and help advance us getting through the pandemic. That's what they thought. So she enrolled her daughter. She got the shot. She suffered a terrible injury, transverse myelitis, paralyzed from the waist down, has all kinds of GI issues. And she was enrolled in the trials. And when they discussed her case in the trials, they said that she merely had GI issues, not mentioning that she was paralyzed, not mentioning that she receives no compensation for her injuries, that all they have to foot all the medical bills, which have to be insane when you go through this, and she may suffer for the rest of her life in a wheelchair. And this was well documented. Pfizer knew about this, the FDA knew about this, they all knew about this, but they said, hey, it's not a big deal. I would wonder, should we just say, hey, we have to accept that some little girls are never going to walk again. We just have to accept that some children are going to be terribly injured for the rest of their life. And we have sufficiently indemnified or protected the vaccine industry from any liability. So they're just going to have to suffer on their own, like her. Are we willing to make that trade, considering that she's not even at serious risk from death from COVID? This is Kyle Warner, who was a professional mountain biker. And he, as a young man, suffered myocarditis, pericarditis, and can no longer mountain bike again. His life has been completely upended. Now, someone say, well, how bad is it? You can't mountain bike again. Well, how would you like to be able to lose your ability to do what you love simply because you took something, because you thought you were going to make a difference, because you thought you were going to help someone, and no one warned you about the serious risks to your heart? I think most people would be kind of upset and feel betrayed. And he testified before the Senate. And again, his case was also documented. It is well documented. The doctors documented. He's one of those VAERS filing that they filed in there. And yet, we ignore this as well? What's even better about this is that when these videos were released on YouTube and these people were talking about their injuries, YouTube decided to suspend Senator Ron Johnson's channel so that you couldn't even see this. Now, how is that even fair? How is that even an open debate? How is that about having a conversation about these things? It isn't. And yet, the people who support the vaccines, the people who support the mandates, the people who support their own brethren losing their job and call those who resist the mandates conspiracy theorists, linked like David Koresh, all this other stuff, do they not care about people being censored? True information being censored? Do they not care that a young girl may never walk again, may never be walked down the aisle during marriage, may never have children? Do they not care about any of that? Here's the interesting thing about the VAERS system. So this is an article that was actually published in 2006. And in this article, they demonstrate that most adverse drug reactions, over 90%, are not reported. So in other words, there's a bias in the system not to report adverse drug events. They know this. They know this, and not just vaccines, but all drugs. That doctors don't even routinely report these things. And the study showed excess of 90% don't even report adverse drug reactions, because we have been so trained that there is a safety bias and an efficacy bias in anything that's approved by the FDA. Vaccines meaning no different. What's interesting is in this study here, these group of researchers from the UK analyzing the VAERS data found that 2/3 of everyone who reports in the VAERS data is a medical professional. is a medical professional, whether they're nurses, whether they're doctors, whether they're PAs, they are medical professionals. And what's fascinating about that is that people say, well, anyone can report. Anyone who does try to report, they will have a screen that will pop up while they're reporting. And it's not easy. It's, for some people, it takes an hour, 45 minutes. What they will find is that a pop-up will come up and tell you that it is a felony to put in something in the VAERS system that is false. Now, what's interesting about this is as they analyzed a number of the deaths recorded in the VAERS system, and they looked at a sample of cases, they could only determine about 14%, only 14% of the cases. That means 85% of the deaths that they looked at were completely associated with the vaccine. In other words, only 14% of the deaths could they say correlation and not causation. And then the other 85%, they could not rule out the vaccine. So much for his argument about correlation and causation. But it gets worse. Just look at the data here. I just want you to see this. And I didn't even include all the data, but I want you to see this. And by December 3rd, there were almost 20,000 deaths. And look at this. By December 3rd, 2021, they had over 32,000 people were permanently disabled, like Maddie DeGarry, like Kyle Warner, suffering the effects. If you go to the next month, you have about a 3,000 jump of deaths, and you have about 7,000 jump in those who are permanently disabled just in 1 month. And then you go on to the next month, and you find again roughly about, unfortunately, because by January 14th, 2022, less people being vaccinated, you have a modest increase in deaths of almost 2,000 deaths. And then you have a massive spike in the number of permanently disabled. It's kind of amazing that you would have about another 4,000 and those who are permanently disabled. And this is pretty incredible. Notice this, at the beginning in August 20th, 2021, there were 1.4 million adverse events reported. By November 12th, there were 1.7 million. By December 3rd, 2021, there were 1.8 million adverse events reported. By January 14th, 2022, 1.9 million. By February 11th, 2022, almost 2 million adverse events. Now, that's a lot of coincidence. That's a lot of correlation, don't you think? What's funny is that the swine flu vaccine developed in 1976 to treat swine flu caused at least 53 people to get Guillain-Barré's syndrome, and about 25 people died, and they pulled that from the market even though they had vaccinated a lot of people, because they understood something about the signal. They understood that if that's what they were tracking, that was only the tip of the iceberg. And indeed, the VAERS system is the tip of the iceberg. A study from Harvard, the Lazarus study, found that out of all the adverse events reported to VAERS, we're getting about 1%. 1%. Indeed, there are whistleblowers from the FDA who argue that in the United States alone, over 45,000 people have died, and some are estimating that the adverse events are bordering on the catastrophic. Now, here's the thing. Shouldn't this just be enough? Over almost 2 million people suffering some injury and some dying. Shouldn't that be enough for us to say, whoa, there's something wrong here? Why should we be giving this to populations who are not even vulnerable for the virus? Why are we doing this? But again, to say all this is conspiracy theory. One thing that isn't conspiracy theory is that the manufacturers of these products have zero liability. So of the 2 million, nearly 2 million adverse events, and the 23,000 deaths, and of the 43,000 people who are permanently disabled, you know what they can't do? They can't hold anyone accountable for what has happened to them or their family members. They can't do that. How is that even fair? If you're going to say that people need to take this as a requirement of their job, shouldn't they be able to hold people accountable? Well, what's interesting, before the Supreme Court struck down the OSHA mandate, that OSHA, who is supposed to record every single work injury and every single injury associated with work. And so one of the things that people were saying is that OSHA, if they're going to require people to take the vaccine, depending on, for their employment, that OSHA should, as it's supposed to, is record all adverse events at work related to the requirements of the job. That's what they were supposed to do. But interestingly, regulators figured, they said, hey, we can't allow that. That might cause people to get some data that will question the vaccine. And so they actually revoked that. So think about it. They didn't want you to find out about it. You can't hold anyone liable about it. And members of your church will call you conspiracy theorist, if you point out the number of adverse events, deaths, and disability. I mean, it's like you just can't win. Interestingly, Professor Miller talks about how he really appreciates Dr. Sean Pittman and Dr. Roger Schwelt and their opinions on the vaccine and how they're safe and effective and how you should get them. And he points about their analysis on VAERS and how it can't be trusted and it's mostly correlation. I mean, think about it. That's a lot of correlation and a lot of coincidence. 2 million adverse events reported. That's an awful lot. How, I mean, really, you're going to say that all of that is? What percentage of that, considering that it's massively underreported? Massively underreported. So that's kind of crazy that they would say all that. But nonetheless, their entitled opinion. What bothers me about this is that while Dr. Pittman and Dr. Schwelt are certainly qualified to give their opinions on why they think the vaccines are safe and effective, what I don't understand is why is it that Professor Miller doesn't look at what other adventists are saying, like this guy here. I would think that Dr. Ben Carson might know a thing or two. He's certainly not anti-vaccine. But notice what he says here about giving the vaccine to children. Listen what he says. The fact of the matter is the mortality rate for children from COVID-19 is 0.025%, which is very similar to the rate of the seasonal flu. And if we haven't been for years and years going through all these things for seasonal flu, plus, we really don't know the long-term impact of these vaccines. So this is really sort of a giant experiment. Do we want to put our children at risk when we know that the risk of the disease to them is relatively small, but we don't know what the future risks are? Why would we do a thing like that? It makes no sense whatsoever. I guess now Dr. Ben Carson, world-renowned neurosurgeon, is a conspiracy theorist as well, according to Dr. Nick Miller. Well, what about Dr. Nick Miller's own colleagues? All the physicians here graduated from Loma Linda. Dr. Mark Sandoval, Dr. Song, Dr. Jonathan Fried, Dr. Andrew Chung, Dr. Joyce Che, Dr. Leila Lewis, and they all, and not all of them are against all vaccines. I think the majority of them actually believe that vaccines have their place, but they believe that the mandates are wrong. And these are people also from Loma Linda. Why is it that we're not to listen to them? What makes Sean Pittman and Roger Schwelt more qualified to talk about the vaccine and their voices don't matter? Also, I just wanted to point out that Dr. Michael Hazel, who is a PhD, an archaeologist, and a fervent student of the Old Testament, has serious problems about the mandates as well, and gave a wonderful sermon in Arizona at the Liberty Health Alliance. And he talked about some of these things and religious freedom. Why is it that his opinion doesn't matter either? All these opinions of well-qualified experts. Again, Michael Hazel is also a professor at Southern Adventist University, just like Nick Miller. I think that they're both in the same boat, both qualified at the same level. Nick Miller doesn't know anything about medicine. Dr. Michael Hazel probably doesn't know anything about medicine. Neither one of them have any training in it. But I think that they both have a right to give their opinion. How come we can't listen to any of these people? We're only told to listen to the people that are going to push the status quo. That makes no sense. No scholar would do that. And I believe that Professor Miller is a scholar, and this is actually going against his very training, not considering the other side of the equation, pretending that all these people are conspiracy theorists when they're actually well qualified to talk about these things. In addition to this, there are many other people who are not members of the church, like Dr. Michael Yeadon, who used to head up the Pfizer development for drugs and things like that, PhD in respiratory pharmacology, and he has serious problems. He's not against vaccines, but he has serious problems about the COVID-19 vaccine. Or what about Dr. Robert Malone, who is an MD, and he worked on the very nascent technology of the messenger RNA technology that we now use in vaccines and other drugs. He worked on that, co-developed it with others, and he has serious problems with the COVID-19 vaccine. We're just to brush him off as conspiracy theorists as well? Or Dr. Peter McCullough, who's published hundreds of articles and believes in vaccines and believes that this vaccine is wrong, thinks that there are more deaths from this vaccine than we're caring to admit, that the fallout with cardiac adverse events is going to be a much higher cost, and that the danger to this vaccine to children is the risks outweigh the benefits. Why can't we listen to him? Is he just another conspiracy theorist? Or what about Dr. Harvey Reich? Dr. Harvey Reich, who is a professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health and Yale School of Medicine. And he believes that early treatment with things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are actually effective in treating this virus. That's what he believes. Are we to also call him a conspiracy theorist? He believes that these things were helpful and would have actually reduced deaths. And he even has questions about the vaccines as well. Is this just another conspiracy theory? Is this just more of this anti-intellectual hocus pocus from the conspiracy theory-laden anti-vaccine movement? What about Dr. Bhakti? Dr. Bhakti has serious questions about this vaccine. He was a professor of medical microbiology and infectious diseases. He worked at the Institute of Medical Microbiology and Hygiene at the Johann Gutenberg University of Mainz, Germany, until he retired. He's published hundreds of articles and on immunology, parasitology, bacteriology, and virology. Are we just and he also served as the editor-in-chief of Medical Microbiology and Immunology, one of the journals in that field. Are we just to say that, well, this is just another conspiracy theory? How many experts, how many deaths, how many people injured, how much does it take for us to say, this is just a little bit more than a conspiracy theory? I mean, this is ridiculous that someone in our church would wipe all this away, ignore all this information, and continue to beat the drum conspiracy theory, David Koresh, right-wing extremists, evangelicals. That's not only unbecoming to a scholar, but it is irresponsible, and I would say unchristian. It is ridiculous. Or what about these group of doctors here of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, which has a modest group of physicians all aligned with it, and these are people who have who some of them really much believe in vaccines, some of them question some vaccines. But one of the things they are for is for freedom in medical decisions to be between a patient and their physician. Another group that we just consider a bunch of conspiracy theories. What about this group of professors and clinical doctors, 26 of them in all, who question the efficacy and the risks of injury from the COVID-19 vaccines? Are we just assume that these are all conspiracy theories as well? Or what about Dr. Aaron Chiardi, who is a professor, who's a psychiatrist and also professor of bioethics, who was fired from his job because he felt that the vaccine mandates didn't consider natural immunity. He was fired for that. You think about it. You fire the guy who's supposed to be telling you, the ombudsman, about bioethics. You fire him because he's against your heavy-handed government-enforced policy. That doesn't sound very wise when this is supposed to be the expert. So again, he's another conspiracy theorist. He deserved to be fired. This is ridiculous. What you're asking us to believe in this article, Professor Miller, what he's asking us to believe is to suspend all these facts, ignore everything to the contrary, and just accept what he and a narrow sliver of experts within the Adventist church are going to say and parrot to one another. This is the most unthinking, uncritical way to resolve conflict in the church, to say, you need to listen to us no matter what. Here's something that bothers me here. This red arrow will look here. At a recent well-publicized meeting that included prominent Adventist figures, had a main speaker who ended his presentation by arguing the reason efficacious treatments were suppressed and dangerous vaccines promoted was because of an alliance between big pharma, government leaders, including the CDC and the WHO, Bill Gates, and the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, I don't think whoever said that, I don't think they threw that in there. All the other ones are certainly all linked. Bill Gates is the second largest funder of the WHO behind the United States. The amount of money the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has put into the NIH, the NIAID, and the CDC is public record. So I'm not sure how this is a conspiracy theory, but Professor Miller says it is. So I guess it is. And many other organizations, including presumably church leaders who go along with the mandate. So he's very upset about that. And what bothers me is I get tired of this broad stroke just saying it's all conspiracy theories. These guys are just making off the cuff statements and we need to condemn it, right? This bothers me because the fact of the matter is there's some serious issues that have been raised about this vaccine. This is the British Medical Journal. And in this article, which was published in 2021, they talked to whistleblowers who were talking about how the trials that Pfizer was conducting did not go, that didn't do what they said they were going to do, that it was actually fraudulent, and they actually didn't keep with the protocols. Listen to what they said. Participants were placed in hallway after injection, not being monitored by clinical staff. That was one of the things that they were supposed to do. That was one of the guidelines of the study. You had to do that. Lack of timely follow-up of patients who experience adverse events. That's something you were supposed to do. Protocol deviations not being reported. Vaccines not being stored at proper temperatures, mislabeled laboratory specimens, and targeting Ventavia staff for reporting these types of problems. So notice that the data that was extracted from Ventavia, a research group which Pfizer outsourced their research to collect data, these insiders, these whistleblowers talk about all these problems that were there, and yet we're just supposed to accept, no, that's just more conspiracy theory that's now being printed in one of the oldest journals in medicine, the British Medical Journal. I don't even have time to go through all of it, so we'll skip through. Here's another thing that Professor Miller might consider a conspiracy theory. It is well known in the scientific literature that if a drug company sponsors the trial, if they direct the trial, set up how the trial should be done, and they write the study, that they are 4 times more likely, the study's 4 times more likely to support a conclusion that favors the drug company. That's just well known. Former editors of major journals all have pointed this out. This was largely discovered with the whole opioid crisis, the Vioxx crisis, which was not an opioid. This was all discovered, the Vioxx crisis, when there was legislation and they showed that the drug was actually very dangerous. And so listen, look at the green here, all right? So this is this very study where they're going to prove the efficacy of the Moderna vaccine. And notice what they have to say in the acknowledgments. They say right here, drug sponsor, so the people funding this study, Moderna was responsible for the over-trial design. Wow. Site selection, monitoring, and data analysis. A medical writer funded by Moderna assisted in drafting the manuscript for submission. Now, we're just supposed to believe, those who believe in the Bible and take the biblical view of human nature, that this had nothing to do with objective science. Well, it gets even worse, because what you find is that many of the authors on this study have consulted with vaccine or have paid consultant fees from vaccine companies that they receive, that some of them are on the payroll, that are employed by Moderna, have stock options in Moderna, that have patents on the vaccine and the virus. We're just supposed to think that none of these guys want the hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to flow into the coffers of their institution and the money that will come to them. These are just honest brokers that couldn't be influenced by millions of dollars. Yeah, that's a bridge too far for anyone. But again, this would be conspiracy theory. Again, Pfizer, the same thing. They did the trial design, they did the data collection, the data analysis, the data interpretation, and lo and behold, their vaccine is safe and effective according to them. Again, we're just supposed to suspend reality and think, well, these guys don't have a dog in the fight, and they're just honest brokers, considering that Pfizer has paid some of the highest of fines out of all the pharmaceutical companies, over $2.3 billion in fines for illegal activities. And we're just supposed to believe that now suddenly they've learned their lesson and they're honest brokers. And even though they're going to make tons of money, it doesn't matter because they're just being honest with us. And we're also supposed to believe that this is a conspiracy theory. I've also reported in the British Medical Journal that the original design, the original trial design for the vaccines didn't actually test whether or not they would reduce transmission, where they would reduce hospitalization, reduce deaths. The only thing they tested was that you would get a positive diagnosis of COVID-19. This is what the actual data shows. And this, they didn't even look at whether or not it would reduce deaths. They didn't look at it would stop transmission, which we know it doesn't, and whether it would reduce hospitalizations. They didn't look at it. They just looked at one factor, whether or not you would come down with a positive diagnosis of COVID-19. We're just supposed to accept that this is just another conspiracy theory, and that indeed there aren't nuances, there aren't facts that are relevant to whether or not these products are actually safe and effective. Here's another problem, is that on the safety part of the vaccine, is another article, conspiracy theory, I'm sure, according to Professor Nick Miller, published in the British Medical Journal. And what the editor does is he interviews these people, and after 6 months, they cut the trials off. They began to unblind their placebo subjects. So in other words, they began to give the placebo group the vaccine. So 96% or 98% of the different groups who were supposed to be the placebo group for the vaccine, they unblinded them and gave them the shot, which means almost all the safety signals are going to be lost after they've done this for 6 months. Is this supposed to be another conspiracy theory that we're just to ignore? We're just to ignore that they basically obliterated the placebo group. They obliterated the placebo group, and so now we won't see the signals of vaccine harms, whether they're few or many. We're just not going to know. It's amazing to think that we're just supposed to consider all. So what it seems like to me is that it's not that there isn't evidence to question these things. It's that we're not to even consider it. We just need to ignore this. And honestly, for someone who's in a position of scholarship and research and debating these things, this is an actual anti-intellectual process that is going on. When you don't want to look at any evidence to the contrary, when you just want to go with the mouthpieces of the church that merely regurgitate the talking points of the CDC, FDA, and other government officials, that is actually anti-intellectual. When you don't want to look at studies, when you don't want to look at data, when you don't want to examine the history of the church in a way that actually shows conclusions contrary to what you believe or think, that's not scholarship. That's actually anti-intellectual, and in some cases, a dishonest approach to thinking about these things. I'm not sure how we can talk about the importance of having an environment where we need to trust the community of faith when the community of faith and the leadership don't want to look at anything contrary to what they're talking about while telling us they've done the research, which if they had, I'm surprised that they don't mention these things, or at least explain why we're wrong for even mentioning them or sharing them. And so this is fascinating here. This is also from the American Medical Association, JAMA, in December 2021. And they looked at a study where they found that 25% of the fully vaccinated individuals who were exposed to the Delta variant through household contact became infected, compared with 38% of unvaccinated individuals. Now, this is amazing. What they're noticing here is that the vaccine isn't that effective in stopping the transmission of the Delta variant. It says the vaccine was 34% effective against the Delta variant, substantially lower than the 40 to 50% effectiveness against household transmission reported before the variant became widespread. This is fascinating because we're told safe and effective, and this is JAMA. They love the vaccine. They have no problem with this. This is not an anti-vaccine rag. They support all drugs and everything. But what's fascinating about this is that even they have to report how ineffective this thing is stopping the spread. And it makes sense because they never tested that. Now on to the purple arrow. Notice what he says here. The irony, of course, is that the anti-vaccine leaders accuse the media of using fear of COVID to manipulate the masses, but they use fear of almost everything else. All the institutions that help organize and protect our lives, including government, healthcare institutions, and church organizations and leaders, to convince its listeners that they alone can be trusted to provide guidance on important health questions. Rather than escaping fear, if you buy their arguments, you will be plunged into a world of constant fear, distrust, one that deeply is at odds with the scriptural teaching about both the church and state. I love this. I think this could have been written in communist China and in North Korea, that You need to listen to the government. You don't need to be made afraid about what they're doing. You don't need to question what they're doing. As a matter of fact, that's all conspiracy theory. And I think that the leaders of China, North Korea, and any other communist state that has ever existed would appreciate this type of writing here. Well, the problem with this is that, again, it's asking everyone to ignore too much. And when we talk about fear, we need to talk about the largest progenitor of fear, which is government. This was a UK Telegraph article talking about how through a Freedom of Information Act request and a book, which we're going to address in just a moment, that they found that the government literally got behavioral scientists and experts that got them together and said, how can we get maximum compliance? And they decided that they would make the UK population deadly afraid of the virus, that was their plan. In this book, State of Fear, which I highly recommend, Laura Dodsworth is far from an anti-vaxxer, and she documents step by step by step how the UK government utilized fear and propaganda to make people afraid, to make them want to lock down, to make them want to applaud the NHS. She documents how these behavioral scientist experts used every single thing to get people to comply, even the mask. There was a debate internally. They said, we know that the masks aren't effective, but if we get people to wear masks, that is a constant reminder that there's danger out there. That's a constant reminder that we're in it together. That's a constant thing saying that we need to take this seriously. That's what she uncovered through interviewing experts, through getting Freedom of Information Act requests filled, all these things. Government was the largest progenitor of fear, not conspiracy theorists of anti-vaccine ilk. Those weren't the biggest progenitors of fear. It was government. This is a document that she uncovered. And this is from the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behavior, or SPIB, and they met together to figure out how can we get the most compliance to government rules, regulations, and mandates. This is what they said. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased, and i.e. fear, among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. That's what they did. They constantly reported the deaths, constantly reported everything they could to whip the people up into fear. Frederick Forsyth, who is a famous fiction writer who lives in the UK, listen to what he says. He says this second paragraph, he says, I've only once seen anything like it, talking about how they utilized fear and propaganda. This was when I was posted to East Germany in 1962. Such a brainwashing tactic was employed to frighten East Berliners into believing that the Berlin Wall was a defensive measure to protect them from the tiny West Berlin, and the Stasi was their guardian, the wall, of course, an instrument of enslavement. I never thought that the government of a country whose uniform I once wore with such pride would sink so low. Those responsible should be identified without delay and ousted from all office over us. Pretty serious. And here in the United States, did we not do the same thing? We had constant death counter. We had constant pronouncements about how dangerous this is, how many people are dying, how infected this is, how you need to use hand sanitizer. I mean, there were people who were literally afraid of getting their Amazon box delivered to them. They would spray it with hand sanitizers. I mean, there are people who still wear gloves touching surfaces, even though long ago the CDC and even Anthony Fauci said, hey, this isn't spread by surfaces. It doesn't matter because people were made afraid. It wasn't conspiracy theorists who are against mandates who came up with this idea that in order to keep children safe who are not at risk of this, they need to play music in these specific tents. It wasn't conspiracy theorists who came up with that. And this was considered, everyone clapped their hands and say, look, we're keeping the kids safe. No, what you're doing is engaging in mind control, propagandizing, and trying to whip people into a state of fear by doing things like this. What's amazing about this is that, and I mentioned this before, is that the fear of children being hospitalized was so great that Justice Sotomayor, the Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor, during oral arguments said that she believed that if we didn't have these mandates in place, that the 100,000 children who were hospitalized from COVID, that would increase. That would increase. And yet the data shows that most of the children who are hospitalized with COVID don't come to the hospital for that reason. They are just tested. And it turns out they're positive, even though they have no symptoms, and they came to the hospital for other reasons. And therefore, the amount of those children hospitalized is overcounted. But even if it's overcounted, it's nowhere close to 100,000. In other words, the decision that allowed the mandates to stay, which Sotomayor has 1/9 out of all the votes, was based on misinformation and fear. This has far more consequence for everyone when people who are in positions of authority and responsibility are responding to a state of fear, making these decisions based on bad data. Bad data. Far more damage is being done. Far more people are being punished and losing their jobs because of this than anything anti-vaxxers have ever said or done. Professor Miller goes on, he talks about more of the anti-vaccinationist movement, and he talks about how, he says Ellen White, one of the founders of Adventism, of the posture we should not take in the face of government authority on the matter, far more central to our prophetic outlook. So basically what he's going to be talking about here is he's pointing out how as Seventh-day Adventists, we shouldn't try to irritate things. We should try to go along with the government. We shouldn't try to bring about trouble before the time, and we should generally respect these things, as Professor Miller believes that he has, probably getting his booster dutifully, wearing his mask dutifully, and doing all those things. He's at complete liberty to do that. But the problem is that when you tell people that we need to go along with it while ignoring some of these glaring events associated with the mandates that clearly infringe on the rights of man and that clearly are going to present civil and religious liberty issues, you've gone too far. No one I know in the movement that is against the mandates says that these mandates are the mark of the beast. No one. It is a misnomer. And I'm sure that many people have tried to make that association, but anyone who is credible, no one has believed that. But even people who are secular have problems with the mandates and the vaccine passports. Naomi Wolf, who is a former Clinton advisor, listen to what she says, second paragraph. Vaccine passport sounds like a fine thing if you don't understand what those platforms can do. I am the CEO of a tech company. I understand what this platform does. Wolf is the author. Wolf, who also is an author, told Fox on March 28th, it is not about the vaccine. It's not about the virus. It's about your data. Once this rolls out, you don't have a choice about being part of the system. What's interesting about this is that she also looks at the vaccine passport system and the Chinese social credit system that they have. And she says, this is really bad. This actually prevents protest. This actually prevents free speech. She's not an anti-vaxxer. She doesn't care about that. She just looks at this and says, this is really bad. Is it wrong for Seventh-day Adventists to read Revelation 13 and say, forbidding buying and selling, unless you receive the mark, that means no participation in society, no commerce, no way to provide for yourself, and being tracked and traced, that could be a problem. Is it wrong for Adventists to look at that and say, I wonder if this could be used? This sounds bad. Maybe we should sound our voice against it. Is that conspiracy theory? I don't think so. Is it conspiracy theory to be concerned with a man named Albert Bourla, who is the CEO of Pfizer, whose company last year earned $72,300 per minute every day of the week, or $104 million per day? Is it wrong for us to be concerned when someone like this, the CEO of Pfizer, gets upset and he demands that those who disagree, who think that his product are harming people, should be considered as criminal and their speech should be silenced? Is it wrong for those who believe in religious liberty, who believe in the Constitution as a document that reflects Protestant wisdom, and have dutifully read their great controversies? Is it wrong for them to be concerned when very powerful people are calling for censorship of their product, when they're calling for vaccine mandates, which are to track and trace and have personal access to your medical information? Is it wrong to be bothered by any of this? Is this more a conspiracy theory? Or what about the idea that the FDA, and this was struck down by a judge, but they were saying that even though we made a decision to approve the vaccine within about 6 to 8 months, we think that the public shouldn't have this data at least for 75 years. Now, fortunately, the lawyers were able to defeat the FDA's request of a judge that was trying to block this. They were able to overturn this. But the fact of the matter is that they made this decision in 6 to 8 months that whether or not you should have the shot, whether or not your children should have the shot, but they don't think that you should have the data. The New York Times recently reported that the CDC has actually been withholding data from the public. This is the New York Times, right? The New York Times, which supports the mandate, supports the vaccines, gushed over Andrew Cuomo, gushes over Kathy Hochul, and everything that they do. They've supported the masking. They've supported it all, right? Even they had to report that the CDC is not releasing data because the CDC is concerned that people will read it and come to the wrong conclusion, which is vaccine hesitancy. That's the wrong conclusion. That is the most paternalistic. That is the most paternalistic way to govern a people. This smacks of high-handed communism, monarchianism, whatever ism you want to call it. That's what it smacks of. Complete centralization of power, saying the people are too stupid to look at these things and make a right decision, so we're not going to release it. Sadly, in this case, Pfizer decided to enter the mix, which is interesting because the lawyers are trying to get the data to the FDA. Pfizer already gave their data to the FDA, and somehow Pfizer says, well, whoa. We also agree that the public shouldn't have this either. And so they're trying to protect whatever rights that they have in it, but they already gave it to the FDA. They shouldn't be able to do it, but they too don't want you to see it until most of us are dead 75 years later. Are we to just say, oh, another conspiracy theory? We shouldn't be bothered by these things that are resulting in liberty. We should just ignore all this. Or what about with the Canadian truckers, right? Peaceful. This was actually legitimately peaceful protest. Yes, they were honking, and yes, it was some disruption with some of the citizens of Ottawa, but mostly peaceful protest. And we saw what happened with them, with the Prime Minister of Canada actually declaring essentially martial law with the Emergencies Act, having these people arrested, banning all protest, taking them away, and then on top of that, having banks freeze people's bank accounts. I mean, the Canadian government essentially blocked the transfer of over $20 million to these trucker protests, whether they did it with Give, Send, Go, whether they were actually to hack the site and block it, or whether they did with GoFundMe. They did the same thing. And so we're just to think, oh, yeah, this is normal. Freezing bank accounts, silencing dissent, silencing protest, arresting people, that's just normal. Fortunately, because of the political winds and how unpopular it was and how people had serious problems with Trudeau's actions, he later rescinded it. But the point was that this is the high-handed iron fist movements to crush dissent. Should not Adventists be concerned about it? I wonder, Professor Miller, who's also a lawyer, who's also a serious voice in religious liberty in the worldwide church, was he not concerned? Did this like take his breath away when he said, whoa, they're freezing the bank accounts? That's not good. That sounds like some medieval papacy stuff. This isn't good. Or was he like, it's a Tuesday? I mean, again, how far are we going to go in ignoring data and ignoring these things and just calling about 25% of the church conspiracy theorists? I mean, this is ridiculous. The other thing that I find interesting is he says that he talks about the recent OSHA mandates and says the recent OSHA mandates contain nothing in it that would have crossed anyone's reasonable religious conscience. It allowed for testing, masking options for those who did not want a vaccine, but cries of outrage, of discrimination, and even persecution went up by many Adventists, and some urged us religious liberty leaders to oppose, even defy these rules. I love it. He's like, well, we're on the side of government. How we would never defy these things. This is a public health issue. How dare you get worked up about any of this? This is reasonable wearing a mask all day. It's reasonable to be tested every week. And it's interesting now, we're finding that some of these test kits, which were ordered from China, actually contain harmful chemicals in them, which poison control has given warnings about, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, it says, it seems that we have still yet to learn the lessons Ellen White was urging in her own day. Yes, we have to learn those lessons. I love this because this statement here acts like we've read everything that Ellen White says, and we believe that she would be standing side by side with Nick Miller. She'd be standing side by side with the leaders of the NAD, the GC, Loma Linda. She'd be standing right there with them, with her mask on, saying, "You guys need to comply. This is not a religious liberty issue." Yet we have no such inkling from it. As a matter of fact, when it comes to masking and all these other things, we have statements like this, and this is kind of interesting. Fresh air will purify the blood, refresh the body, and help it make it strong and healthy. The invigoration produced will be reflected upon the mind, imparting to it tone, clearness, as well as a degree of composure and serenity. It gives a healthful stimulus to the appetite, renders the digestion of food more perfect, and induces a sound, sweet sleep. Living in close, ill-ventilated rooms weakens the system, makes the mind gloomy or the skin sallow and the circulation feeble and the blood moves sluggishly, digestion is retarded, and the system is rendered peculiarly sensitive to cold. One should so accustom himself to fresh, cool air that he will not be affected by slight changes of temperature. Of course, he should be careful not to sit in a draft in a cold room when weary or when in perspiration. Sounds like to me she would want more fresh air, not less. Like if she were here today, she'd probably say, hey, we should open up the windows in the church so there's more ventilation, not less, and not put masks, particularly on children or anyone else. Now, we don't know what her opinion would have been on masks, but it seems to me that she would have been for more fresh air, not less. Notice she says this: in order to have good blood, we must breathe well, full, deep inspirations with a mask on. Nope, she doesn't say that. Of pure air, which fill the lungs with oxygen, purify the blood. They impart to it a bright color and send it a life-giving current to every part of the body. A good respiration soothes the nerves. It stimulates the appetite, renders digestion more perfect, and induces a sound and refreshing sleep. And the lungs, this is fascinating, the lungs are constantly throwing off impurities, and they need to be constantly supplied with fresh air. Now think about what she just said there. You think that she would have been like, yes, keeping a cloth over your face where your lungs are constantly throwing off impurities, and you're rebreathing those is really good health. Would she say that in a surgical environment? Probably not. But going to a store, going outside, going to your car, riding in your car by yourself, being at an airport, being anywhere, would she say that? No, she would actually be for more breathing, more fresh air. That's what it seems. Impure air does not afford the necessary supply of oxygen, and the blood passes to the brain and other organs without being vitalized. Hence the necessity of thorough ventilation. To live in close, ill-ventilated rooms where the air is bad, where the air is dead and vitiated, weakens the entire system. It becomes peculiarly sensitive to the influence of cold, and slight exposure induces disease. It is close confinement indoors that makes many women pale and feeble. They breathe the same air over and over until it becomes laden with poisonous matter thrown off through the lungs and pores, and impurities are thus conveyed back into the blood. I'm not sure she would be for people wearing masks all day. Not even surgeons, when they do surgery, wear masks all day. Sometimes they will have to take a break and breathe and then put a new mask on. And sometimes they only do, a couple hour procedures and then they're done. They're not wearing it in their car. They're not wearing it to go get something to eat. They're not wearing it every single place that they go, Because why? This very principle right here, that you're actually rebreathing things that aren't good. Interestingly, the science seems to back this up. Dr. Paul Alexander, who was one of the medical advisors in the Trump administration, actually looked at over 150 studies and found that masks were not all they were cracked up to be. And so this is kind of fascinating, considering everything we were told about masks, and particularly cloth masks, and wearing them all day, all this other stuff, not as effective as we thought. So how reasonable is the restriction that OSHA put on you that you need to wear a mask all day when it seems to be more of a punitive thing? And considering that those who have the vaccine are just as likely to spread it as those who are unvaccinated. Now, here's the thing. One of the things that he proposes, because he's very upset about these different conspiracy theories, is that he believes that the only way to overcome it is by the community of believers. And what he really means, it's not that every believer has a place at the table. There are some believers who are more equal than others and deserve their opinions to be heard, while others who are part of the conspiracy theory anti-vax movement don't have a right at the table. And so he believes that what we need to do is set up a system where people need to learn to trust their leaders, and they need to be in a community where they trust those who are in authority. This is what he is saying here. And what's fascinating about this is, again, this is not standing with the evidence. This is merely saying you need to go ahead and you need to accept the authorities in the church, the authorities in our medical community. You need to accept that. You don't need to do the thinking yourself. You don't need to read articles like this, which talk about how when they examined the amount of virus in both the nasal passage of the vaccinated and unvaccinated, they found that they had the same loads, and which means that you could spread the virus or even variants of the virus, as what had happened with South Africa with the Omicron variant. You could spread that even if you were vaccinated, which is the whole reason why the CDC said, hey, you got to wear your masks even if you're vaccinated, because they knew you could still spread it. So what are we doing? When you're talking about, well, you need to take this to protect everyone, protect them from what? If you can still spread it after you've been vaccinated, what are you protecting anyone? This is ridiculous. But again, this is the whole point is that you have to ignore this. What's the other thing you have to ignore, and you have to submit to the experts because they're experts in the church, is you have to ignore previous infection and the immunity that it gives. You have to ignore studies like this in Nature Immunology, where all these authors show how robust natural immunity is and how it actually creates memory in CD4 and CD8 T helper cells. That's what we're supposed to do. We're just supposed to ignore this as well, that people who actually had the virus and have overcome are immune. We're also supposed to ignore an article like this, where people who are part of the NIAID and other things are saying, hey, we need to figure out to manufacture antibodies that are normally made to natural infections. In other words, natural infection and the antibodies made to natural infection are so good that they can respond to variants. We can't do this. We need to figure out a way to do this. The whole article here says we need to figure out how to make drugs that most mimic the human immune system to generate these broad antibodies that you naturally develop when you face the infection regularly. So this is fascinating that even they admit, while they're saying we need to make drugs to stimulate the immune system like natural infection so you can have these awesome antibodies, or to clone these antibodies, they're admitting tacit that natural infection produces better antibodies than their artificially stimulated vaccine. Again, this all lines up with the data that natural infection is superior to vaccine. And here's a study from Israel published in Science magazine, where they found that you were 13 times more likely to be infected than unvaccinated people who were previously infected with the coronavirus. So if you received 2 doses of the vaccine, which is what you needed in Israel, you were 13 times more likely to be infected than those who were unvaccinated but previously infected. Amazing. So they looked at a number of people and they came to that conclusion that natural immunity was superior to artificially vaccine stimulated immunity, even after 2 doses. And this, by the way, convinced the 3rd dose and a 4th dose, and some are even arguing for the 5th dose. How many doses do we need till we say, hey, man, this isn't working? Apparently not until the shareholders of Pfizer and Moderna are satisfied. But that's more conspiracy theories. He goes back to his whole idea of epistemology, which is the way, how do we arrive at truth? And what he's concerned with is the notion that some people in the church are citing the priesthood of all believers. He doesn't believe that the priesthood of all believers means that everyone studies their Bible and comes to conclusions based on the evidence. What he believes it means is that, yes, you read your Bible, but you do it under the guidance of senior leadership. You do it under the guidance of those who are in our colleges and our universities. You need to trust them. You need to follow them. That's the exact opposite. That's the exact opposite of the Protestant Reformation. William Tyndale didn't say to the priest, he didn't say, look, I'm going to translate the Bible so that one day the plowboy will sit underneath your wing while you read it to him and tell him what it means. No, he said that I'm going to translate the Bible in the English language, that a plowboy will know more about the scriptures than will you and the popes. That's what he said. See, the dangerous thing about the priesthood of all believers is it makes people who are willing to do research ungovernable. And this is an anathema to Professor Miller. He believes that you need to learn to fall in line. You need to recognize when people who are in authority have done research or whatever, you need to recognize it. And listen, to some extent, I agree that there are people who've done research that you should listen to, but I don't agree that we should just merely give them our brains and whatever they say we should believe. I believe when it comes to your body and when it comes to salvation, you need to study these things out. Even Ellen White talks about the importance of learning your own body, that she even said that is, you not only should you should study the Bible, but you should also learn human physiology so that you know how to take care of your body. I mean, whatever happened to that? Instead, we're supposed to outsource our thinking to a cloud of experts and leaders. And again, more of his statements here. And he, in the purple box, he makes the statement that he likes the idea of the collegium, the college, the university setting where there's a debate of ideas. I've been to Andrews, I've been to some of our universities. There isn't an open debate about certain ideas. There may be an open debate about whether or not 1844 really matters. There may be an open debate whether or not you can trust the Bible, whether or not the Sabbath is really binding, or how to keep the Sabbath. There may be open debate questioning every single doctrine that matters in our church. There may be an open debate about that, but there is not an open debate about certain issues, and vaccines are definitely one of them. There's not an open debate. As a matter of fact, when they had the Liberty and Health Alliance at the Village SDA Church, which is not far from Andrews, and they tried to invite other people, they were only able to get Dr. Roger Schwelt, who came on there wanting to talk about hydrotherapy and then told everyone they were essentially wrong, believing in this anti-vaccine rhetoric. It seems to me that the side that is anti-mandate and against the heavy-handed tactics of the government are far more willing to sit at the table with people that they disagree with than the collegium, the Adventist elite, the ivory tower elite. They are more willing to do that than those who are saying we need the priesthood of all believers and essentially listen to the experts. More willing. It would be fascinating to see a symposium at Andrews where Professor Miller is a professor of church history there. It'd be fascinating to see, call up people who've actually looked at the Adventist history, who actually are physicians, and do the same thing on the other side and have an open discussion. That would be open and honest debate. But no, what we get is condemnation. You get linking and saying that the people who disagree with Professor Miller, are more akin to Branch Davidians than they are actual members of your own church. This is unacceptable. Unacceptable. No right to say that, and no evidence to back that up. Just mere assertion when he says that people who read VAERS are coming to a correlation instead of a causation conclusion. I would argue that he's done far worse with saying that the people who reject mandates in his church are Branch Davidians. It's far worse than that. Anyways, he finishes his article, and I will certainly include the link. Now, there is one thing I wanted to talk about in this, and I didn't get a chance. And what I'm going to do is we'll do a separate video, and it's going to be with me and my co-author, and we're actually going to talk about our experience with overcoming COVID. We have both had it, and we want to talk about it. But one of the things I want to point out is that in that article that he wrote in the Professor Miller wrote in Lake Union Herald, he talks about a functional medicine doctor. And I want to talk about this with my co-author because he's actually he has studied functional medicine. He knows an awful lot about it. And I want to point out the irony of saying that you're an expert and we need to listen to you when you talk about something you know nothing about. And this is the idea that you want us to trust you, but you want to call the very people that you want to bring to heal, that you want to bring into obedience, you link them with Branch Davidians, you call them conspiracy theorists, right-wingers, more in harmony with evangelicals. This seems to be the exact opposite of all the toleration, all the looking out for the downtrodden that you profess to do with aligning yourself with Black Lives Matters and critical race theory. This seems to be the exact opposite approach. It's almost like what Justin Trudeau did. He loves the LGBTQAIP movement, supports that. He stood in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And all those protests were fine until someone protested his policies. It seems like when someone actually wants to talk about liberty and issues that matter, the church has no tolerance. The government of Canada had no tolerance. And this is a problem. If we're ever going to be united in prophecy and as a body of believers, we need to get over ourselves and get over our positions and stop being so proud and saying, well, I'm an expert, people need to listen to me. No, the priesthood of all believers is that you look at the evidence and you follow that. And if you don't have the evidence, or if you're going to ignore the evidence, then you don't deserve to be listened to. And I think that's the take home from all of this. And God bless you all. Thank you for making it through all this. And I hope that you will tune in hopefully soon to our next video, which should be on my co-author and I discussing our experiences with COVID-19. God bless and be safe.